Hello, everybody, and good morning.
Morning.
Oke, siap 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, on.
Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. This is Dino Patijala, founder of Foreign Policy Community of Indonesia, or FPCI. We are very happy to have all of you here joining us today for this very important discussion on the state of play with regard to counterterrorism in the midst of the COVID-19 crisis, which we are all facing. I'm just here by way of just really welcoming and opening this good discussions. We are having a great panel today. We have the head of Indonesian counterterrorism task force, Komjen Polisi Dr. Andas Boy Rafli Amar, who will be joining us later on. We also have Nur Huda Ismail, the founder of Institute for International Peace Building in Indonesia. We have from the Philippines, Dr. Romel Banloy, who is a good friend of mine. I always see him in the circuit. He is the chairman of the Philippine Institute for Peace, Violence, and Terrorism Research. We have from Washington, D.C., Georgetown, Dr. Joshua Gelster, who is the former senior director for counterterrorism at the U.S. National Security Council. And we have Leanne Close, who is the head of counterterrorism program at Australian Strategic Policy Institute, or ASPI, with whom in FPCI have always good cooperation with. I'm just gonna welcome everybody, and we have a great moderator, our good friend Andini Effendi, who is going to take over from me right away and conduct this discussion. So I wish all of you a very good, substantive discussions, and I know many of us will take notes of what we have to say today. Have a good discussions.
All right, here we go. Thank you, Padino. So I would like to introduce our speakers for the talk this morning, Jakarta time. First is Nur Huda Ismail, a longtime friend of mine. He is the founder of the Institute for International Peace Building in Indonesia, and also a visiting fellow at the Raja Ratnam School of International Studies in Singapore. We have Dr. Romel Banloy, chairman of the Philippine Institute for Peace, Violence, and Terrorism Research. Dr. Joshua Geltzer, executive director of Georgetown University's Institute for Constitutional Advocacy and Protection, and also a former senior director for counterterrorism at the U.S. National Security Council, NSC, from 2015 to 2017. From Australia, we have Leanne Close, head counterterrorism program at Australian Strategic Policy Institute. And last but not least, who will be joining us later is Pak Komjen Pol Boy Rafli Amar, head of Indonesian National Counterterrorism Agency, or BNPT. So in this discussion, we would like for the speakers to have a fluid discussion. So I will share a question, and then all of you may answer it. Just unmute and then take turns to answer. I will start with like the general situation, I guess. What are the trends if we're talking about terrorism nowadays? Because there are reports indicates that how most national governments' preoccupation with the COVID-19 could open a crack that might endanger national security. We also heard it here in Indonesia. Mas Huda, I think I would like to start with you. What is your thought on this?
I think one thing that it is important to note that COVID-19 will not go away anytime soon. And then ignoring this issue for the last at least 3 months or so doesn't mean that the program also will go away. Because especially now we have a kind of a time bomb with the issue of repatriation, the possible repatriation of some of Indonesians who are stuck in the camp, as well as the current more still mobilization in the Indonesian to southern Philippines, also Indonesian might be going to Afghanistan and other countries. So now we are seeing the threat of existing foreign fighters, Indonesian foreign fighters who might make connection with other fighters all over the world, and the possibility of these people to coming back. Do we ready as a nation? But at the moment, everyone is struggling. And locally now, we have a problem, as you know very well, our perennial issue with recidivisms, with the case of the prison. Many, at least since the first Bali bombing in 2002, we are seeing at least 10% cases of recidivists. Yeah. So released at 900, so we are seeing over 80, almost 80 cases of recidivism. And while we are failing to dealing with this, it might bring problem globally, because some of those recidivists eventually travel to Syria, travel to my dear friend place Romel, and then also some of them now even trying to go to Afghanistan. So this is the issue that we cannot deal alone. It requires regional and global cooperations, like the same with COVID, I think.
Right. So I would like to ask Josh, or maybe Rama can also jump into this question though. Do you see like any new trend in terms of like what kind of emerging new forms of terrorism in the era of COVID?
I think from a U.S. perspective, the threat of far-right terrorism, white supremacist terrorism, white nationalist terrorism, this was already something of growing concern in the United States. The numbers for the past couple of years have been higher for lethalities caused by far-right terrorism on U.S. soil than jihadist or other international, more traditional international forms of terrorism. I think COVID has accelerated that concern, because the extent to which people are, by design, retreating, spending more time alone, or at least less time with anything beyond their immediate family, more time online, more time consuming propaganda, recruitment materials, and at times conspiracies deliberately perpetrated by groups seeking to recruit and radicalize. That, I worry, is going to accelerate the already dangerous trend of the threat posed by far-right terrorism in the United States.
Josh, it's interesting that you label them as terrorists.
We do, and how to talk about it has become part of the conversation here in the United States as well, because I think those of us who see politically motivated violence, that's a rough paraphrase of the U.S. Code's statutory definition of terrorism. We see it no matter the motivating ideology, whether it's ISIS pointing to its motivating ideology, or whether it's a neo-Nazi group pointing to its motivating ideology. But the tools, at least under US law, for how to prosecute cases involving them, how to designate groups, those are very different. And I think we are having a conversation here in the United States about whether we are situated properly with the right legal authorities, the right policies to deal with this emerging form.
Right. Rama, what about you? What other examples, I guess, that you have encountered in your work?
Well, in the Philippines, the current trend right now is the rise of suicide terrorism. It was viewed before that suicide terrorism was impossible to happen in a predominantly Christian country, with the majority of Muslim population being secular rather than religious. But 3 years after the Marawi siege, we have witnessed at least 5 major suicide bombing attacks and 1 failed suicide bombing attack. And if you're familiar with the recent news about encounter between the police and the military was trying to prevent 2 female suicide terrorists, and one of those being under surveillance is in fact an Indonesian female suicide bomber, the daughter of the Indonesian suicide bomber responsible for the Hulu Cathedral. So that's now happening in the Philippines, the rise of suicide terrorism. And the COVID-19 pandemic, in fact, provided pro-ISIS terrorist groups in the Philippines opportunities to intensify their propaganda and recruitment activities, especially now that the pandemic is making it difficult for the Bangsamoro government to deliver because of economic difficulties, and they are taking advantage of that economic difficulties to recruit more fighters, not only through ideological recruitment, but also through material inducements, promising them money if they want to fight in the name of Allah. You know, they are recruited not as a mercenary, but of course, in our language, they are being recruited as mercenaries, but in their narrative, they are recruiting them to become soldiers of Allah. And as soldiers of Allah, they are doing it not for themselves, they are doing it higher than themselves. So that's the kind of narrative that they are propagating. And this kind of narrative is being spread in social media, especially right now, where all people are using social media to connect with each other. So that's the current trend happening right now in the Philippines.
Right. So, Leanne, I would like to ask you though, as people are getting, well, obviously we're entering a crisis. Basically, their financial means is no longer strong, I guess, from the way before pandemic. And how do you see this without, government assistance and then also humanitarian aid, especially in conflict zones? Do you think that this vacuum will leave more people more vulnerable in terms of like radicalization efforts?
Yeah, certainly. We've seen some recent examples. I think the nexus between organised crime and ISIS, for example, the allegations there where Italian authorities seized about 14 tons of illegal drugs about a week ago. And they're saying that was used and developed by operatives in ISIL, in Iraq, Syria, to fund terrorist activities. So definitely the humanitarian aid issue is probably stopping or certain funds and other things being able to be diverted in those regions. But what we see, though, is there's an increase in probably planning and ability online, that the technology, social media still is an issue. And from an Australian perspective, similar issues to those outlined by Joshua are also of concern to us in Australia. The different nationalistic right-wing narratives that are starting to take hold. Certainly COVID-19 has, I think, accelerated those. It's put a different emphasis on racism, on cultural discourse, I think, online. Thankfully, we haven't seen that move to violence necessarily in Australia, but with the impact of COVID on the economy, on individuals, we are certainly concerned that could be a threat to Australia and internationally going forward.
Okay, I would like to share an open question, though. Anyone can answer this, because there is this narrative where, if we're talking about COVID, some people in Indonesia believe that the coronavirus is a part of a weapon of terrorism. And some experts call it bioterrorism. Do you see that this trend emerging from the pandemic? And first of all, is it real? Is this a bioterrorism? Will you label it as that? And then is this like a growing trend? Anyone can answer.
I think let me answer first, so that easier for me that other people can follow up. So I don't think that we can label it as a bioterrorism or even that terrorism, even thinking loudly that might use this. But definitely some of the people within the group, at least I have been following the chat, the discussion among the terrorists, especially among the ISIS. There is no single narrative among the group. Some of them will call it, oh, this is the punishment from God. Right. Punishments. And the second thing, we'll say, wow, this is a time for us to actually, this is the army of punishment, and second thing, the army. So because of that, let's carry out an attack where the secular government are struggling. So we are seeing in Indonesia, of course, what happened in Poso and recently in a number of arrests. The narrative because of that. And ISIS Central openly release a fatwa in their virtual caliphate, suggesting that its follower to carry out an attack in this very moment. So yeah, this is basically my assessment on your question, and maybe others can contribute it more.
Anyone? Josh, Rommel?
Yeah, to echo that, this moment presents the dangerous potential for storytelling around it. Right, we have no reason at this point from either the intelligence community here in the United States or others in other countries to believe that this was created by anything other than nature, and yet it is so dramatic, it's so horrific in its effects, this pandemic, that it yields itself to storytelling. And in essence, that's what recruitment and radicalization is. It's a form of storytelling. And there are big lies, big pieces of disinformation you can tell, such as conjuring it as being an intentional weapon without any apparent basis. Or there are smaller half-truths. And what we see in the United States are groups of various ideological stripes talking about or alleging that the government, in fact, I should say governments, federal and state and city here in the United States, at least, are exploiting the moment, are overreaching in their response. And it's becoming something of a rallying cry. At times, maybe part of a political discourse, but at times that rallying cry trends towards a call to violence. So when something as dramatic as this pandemic is unfolding, it does allow those who want to make dramatic claims something to latch onto.
Anyone else want to jump in? Yes, go ahead, Ramel.
Yes, I have a reason to believe that terrorist groups worldwide, including ISIS and even Al-Qaeda, can weaponize COVID-19 pandemic. If you will look at the narrative they are sharing via social media, they are describing coronavirus as a weapon. So if you are Muslim and if you are in jihad and you want to continue your jihad amidst the pandemic, they are encouraging those Muslim infected by COVID-19 to infect others. So that kind of social media stories are being circulated now around chat groups that we are monitoring. So I have a reason to believe that pro-ISIS groups can use the COVID-19 pandemic as a weapon for bioterrorism.
Okay, Leanne, you want to add more to that?
The only thing I could really add is exactly some of the points that have been made already. We have various groups using the narrative around COVID-19 to try and engender people to come to their cause. I think that disinformation is really the key here, and it's extremely hard to stop the conspiracy theories and other things. We've seen violence around 5G towers in Australia, or protest actions and other things of that nature. So people are using it for their own ends. Some people are believing the disinformation as well. So the more that we can get our accurate facts and information to people, the better. But the spread of those sorts of things through social media is just so epidemic in many respects that it is difficult to counter that narrative.
Right. Okay. We're still waiting for Pak Boy, but we have audience live on YouTube as well, because we're currently live on FPCI YouTube channel. And if there are questions, please fill it in, whether in the Q&A box on the webinar or on the Facebook, or sorry, YouTube chat. And then FPCI will filter it out and I will read the questions to our speaker. I'll go back to Mas Huda. Mas Huda, still about trends now. What do you think about the reintegration efforts change, or may perhaps not change, I guess, under the current COVID pandemic?
Yeah, I think very tough question to answer, because the COVID itself is still very short, and then we haven't really measured. But definitely, based on my years' experience helping these individuals who used to involve in terrorism and to go back to society, it required a number of stages, and it's still hard for me to imagine that only using online, because of social distancing, it's very hard for actually government come up with offline intervention, right? So yeah, I think the integration will pose a number of challenges even before COVID itself. As you know well, here in Indonesia, we are struggling with this issue of reintegration. There are cases of successful, of course, but if you can see, in terms of number itself, might look very low, less than 10% compared to other criminal cases, let's say drug, for instance, almost more than 50%. But 10% cases out of 900 is quite a lot, and to carry out a terrorist attack, you don't need big number of people, So yeah, this is a challenge, and therefore, in the last 3 years, I have been embarking, as you know well, directly engage in local community, very hyper grassroots community, to prepare them so that they can accept anyone who released terrorists to go back to new life, as well as a possible returnees coming from Middle East. And this is not easy.
Right. So you're saying because of the pandemic, the strategy will be more personalized?
I think so too. I think the best way, the best strategy always personalized, because there is, in this very issue, there is no, the doctrine will be no one size fits for all. Every approach should be very different. Cases, those who involved in Marawi should be different. Those involved in Syria should be different. Those involved in local conflict is different, because the narrative where they join is also different. Different trajectory should come up with a different approach of social integration as well. Those being radicalized in conflict, those being radicalized only through social media. So it's required, like a tailor-made approach, one shoot, one kill type of approach.
Right. Okay. So I'll move on to Rommel then. So as we know that the Philippines has been very strict with the quarantine during this pandemic. So what do you think of, has this pandemic has been affecting Philippines' ability to attend to counter-terrorism issues? Specifically, if I may add here, in relation to terrorism groups in the Philippines, such as Abu Sayyaf, Bangsamoro, and then we talk about Jamaah Islamiyah, and then New People's Army and other associated groups.
Yes, the COVID-19 pandemic is in fact affecting the ability of the law enforcement authorities to respond to terrorist threats, because their attentions now are divided over implementing the quarantine measures and at the same time continuing their counter-terrorism operations. We have a big problem in the Philippines because we are facing two major insurgency problems. We have insurgency problems emanating from the Communist Front and insurgency problems emanating from the Muslim Front, or some other would call it the Moro Front. And Muslim insurgency is very, very complicated because there are various groups operating, groups associated with ISIS and groups not associated with ISIS, and groups now helping the Philippine government in peace building. And I'm talking about the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, which is now taking the lead in the Bangsamoro government, and the Moro National Liberation Front, who is still advocating for federalism in Mindanao. But if you talk about pro-ISIS groups, they have not stopped their terrorist operations during the pandemic. In fact, they took advantage of the pandemic to mount terrorist attacks. For example, last April, they attacked military detachments that killed around 11 soldiers and 14 others because they were doing quarantine measures. And based on our monitoring of violent incidents in Mindanao since the COVID pandemic was implemented in March 16 until now, we have monitored more than 150 violent incidents coming not only from the Abu Sayyaf group, but also from the Bangsamoro Islamic Freedom Fighter. And the Bangsamoro Islamic Freedom Fighter is also very complicated because we are facing three major groups, and two of these groups are associated with ISIS. And close to Bangsamoro Islamic Freedom Fighters operating in central Mindanao, you go further east, you'll see that the New People's Army also continuing their military activities. But when the United Nations called for ceasefire, the Communist Party of the Philippines ordered the New People's Army to follow the ceasefire initiative of the United Nations. But there are still other personalities associated with NPA or New People's Army still continuing their violent activities. And if you talk about the Abu Sayyaf Group just recently kidnapped another foreign nationals in a boat, and they continue to do kidnapping operations in the waters of Sabah and Tawi-Tawi. And when you talk about Abu Sayyaf Group, we are talking not only one Abu Sayyaf Group, but two Abu Sayyaf groups associated with ISIS. The Abu Sayyaf Group in Sulu, headed by Hadjan Sawadjaan, and the Abu Sayyaf Group in Basilan, headed by, right now, by Puruji Indama. But we have another Abu Sayyaf Group, which is more secular rather than religious, the Abu Sayyaf Group being headed by Radulan Sayron, who is still under the most wanted personality by the U.S. State Department. So we have all these groups operating, but the pro-ISIS groups, we have a new group operating in central Mindanao, which I think is more dangerous because it's the only group that pledged allegiance to Al-Qurashi, the new leader of ISIS, and that group is called the Salahuddin Group because it's being headed by Hassan Salahuddin, and Hassan Salahuddin was nobody during the time of Al-Qaeda. Just was one of the junior followers of Dulmatin, Omar Patek, but he rose into prominence when Basit Usman was killed in central Mindanao, and he took the leadership of leading the pro-ISIS group in central Mindanao and operating largely in Sultan Kudarat, and promising to continue the fight and promising to establish the Dawliyah Islamiyah Philippines, or the Islamic State in the Philippines. So we have several pro-ISIS groups, and if you will allow me to present a slide of this pro-ISIS group, can I share a slide? So
go ahead, please.
Audience would have a better understanding of what's happening. Let me get my slide. Okay, can you see my slide now? Okay.
Yes,
so if you will look at the whole architecture of Dawliyah Islamiyah Philippines, we have the Abu Sayyaf Group operating in Cebu, Basilan, and Tawi-Tawi up to Sabah, and we have the Indama Group operating largely in Basilan, but with followers in Zamboanga Peninsula, particularly in Zamboanga City and Zamboanga Sibugay. Then in central Mindanao, particularly in the provinces of Maguindanao, Sultan Kudarat, and Lanao provinces, particularly in Lanao del Sur, we have the Bangsamoro Islamic Freedom Fighters, and the most loyal follower of ISIS is the Turaipi Group, the former vice chairman of the Bangsamoro Islamic Freedom Fighters. So he's now heading this Dawliyah Islamiyah Turaipi Group. And we still have now the remnants of the Mauti Group, and remnants of the Mauti Group are being headed now by a relative of the Maute and a relative of Mimbantas called the Care Mimbantas Group. So he took over the leadership and promising to continue the fight of ISIS. Then we still have the Ansar Khalifa Philippines, called the Magid Group in Socsargen area, so South Cotabato, Sultan Kudarat, General Santos, but it's being headed by a young lieutenant by the name of Jeffrey Nilong, so they call it the Nilong Group. Then we have the Salahuddin Group and then aside from all these pro-Islamic groups are Muslim converts, predominantly Muslim converts, operating in Luzon and Visayas, and that those are being represented by a group called Suyuful Khilafa fi Luzon, which aims to establish Islamic state in Luzon area. And supporting all these groups are foreign terrorist fighters, predominantly Indonesians and Malaysians. And Indonesians continue to travel to Mindanao using Manado and Roro facilities there to enter General Santos, the Davao, and even going as far as General Santos City. And Malaysians will normally operate in Sabah, Tawi-Tawi. So we have foreign terrorist fighters, and not only foreign terrorist fighters from Indonesia and Malaysia, but also from the Middle East, from the Arab world. We have Egyptians, we have Somalis. So we have foreign terrorist fighters. And if you are familiar with my work on foreign terrorist fighters, their entry continues in the Philippines. So that is complicating the nature of terrorist threats in the Philippines. And the COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated the nature of this threat, prompting our government to pass an anti-terrorism law as an urgent measure to counter them.
Right. Okay, so Rama, I would like to ask you this though. So I remember President Duterte was very tough on terrorism. So what is the current effort now with the situation? Is he still have a strong measure against terrorism in the Philippines, or I mean, how does it work on the ground? Looking at the current pandemic.
Yeah, the Duterte administration is now pursuing a tougher legal measure against terrorism by passing Republic Act 11479 or Anti-Terrorism Law of 2020 that provides greater power for law enforcement authorities to counter not only acts of terrorism, but prior to acts of terrorism, like even inciting to terrorism, facilitating terrorism, recruitment to terrorism, training terrorism, and financing of terrorism. So it strengthens the counter-legal measure of the Philippine government with the enactment of this law. But at the same time, Duterte ordered the military to intensify its focused military operations against the Abu Sayyaf group and against pro-ISIS groups operating in Mindanao. And also, right now, the Philippine government also includes the New People's Army in the list of terrorist groups that require focused military operations. And at the same time, the Philippine National Police is also ordered by President Duterte to intensify their law enforcement operations, particularly in the area of intelligence gathering and particularly in the area of intelligence gathering. So if we talk about the role of the military and the police in counterterrorism, if the government wants search and destroy operations, then the military will be mobilized to conduct airstrike or face-to-face battle against terrorist groups. But when the Philippine government wants the terrorist personalities to be put in jail, then they will mobilize the power of the police to issue warrant of arrest in order to put these terrorists to justice. Those are the countermeasures. But at the same time, the Philippine government is also pursuing non-military and non-police measures through the formulation of the National Action Plan to prevent and counter violent extremism. And even the Anti-Terrorism Law of 2020 requires the implementation of preventing and countering the violent extremism because of the recognition that the problem of terrorism in the Philippines is a complex problem that requires comprehensive solution. So this is the explanation of the Philippine government that the anti-terrorism law is only strengthening the legal measure against terrorist groups, but it requires other measures in order to really address the underlying conditions that make terrorism in the Philippines to thrive. And these underlying conditions are political, economic, social, cultural, and even religious. It can even take into account personal considerations. So that's the nature of counterterrorism measures being implemented now by Duterte. And with the enactment of the Anti-Terrorism Law of 2020, President Duterte is in fact adding more teeth to the law in order to run after terrorist groups, not only terrorist groups, but also personalities and organizations supporting, financing, training, cuddling, okay, and even encouraging these groups to commit acts of terrorism.
Very well. All right, let's move on to Josh. So before I move on to Josh, actually, I still see attendee who is writing their question in the chat box. I kindly ask you to put your question in the Q&A box, okay? Otherwise, it will be very difficult for us to filter it out, and it will mess up our conversation within the chat box. So please kindly put your question within the Q&A box. So Josh, you stated in the article Politico how the coronavirus is reshaping terrorist attack plans, that the virus can provoke threats in new ways. Perhaps you can explain what are the new ways, and then what do you think that have emerging globally as a result of the pandemic?
Yeah, the comments I made in that piece, which I thought was a strong piece early in the days of what, at least here in the United States, is a response to the pandemic that just seems to be continuing rather than coming to any sort of end in sight, it reflected on the fact that there was already a sense of deliberate cultivation of distrust of government in the face of a very unusual set of circumstances and some very unusual asks, or in some cases requirements by the government. So you saw in the early days of the response to the pandemic here in the United States, an attempted attack on a hospital ship that somehow what we would normally think of as aid to those suffering in a medical emergency was contorted through a worldview that's deliberately being propagated by extremists into some sort of threat, something to which the response should be violence. We also saw an attempted hospital attack virtually on the other side of the country. So it's not any one geography, and thankfully those who try to stop these things kept those incidents from becoming full-blown attacks with casualties. But we saw even then that there was a moment where you could push on this notion of distrust. You could try to spark a violent response. And even if most of your intended audience wouldn't respond to it, some tiny portion would. But as someone said earlier, it only takes one or a handful of folks to at least attempt a terrorist attack, and in some cases succeed. So that's the kind of circumstances that I think are worth worrying about as this pandemic continues.
Right. Okay. So this is interesting though, because as we talk about war on terrorism, so I read a piece, or was it like someone who mentioned it, like the Third World War was war on terrorism because of 9/11. And then the Fourth World War was something else I forgot. And the Fifth World War was the war on narratives. So is it true, Josh, you think that war on terrorism has been a passé, and then now I guess the terrorists is using the narratives as their new weapons for their fight, I guess?
I think probably narratives are baked into these national security problems at every stage. I mean, in some ways, mobilizing forces for world war, at least here in the United States, was about a narrative, a sense of what we were fighting against and what we were fighting for. Certainly terrorism of the 9/11 and immediately post 9/11 variety, that had a narrative to it. But bin Laden had a very particular narrative. That it wasn't that he thought an attack like 9/11 on its own could galvanize the support or bring about the change he wanted. Instead, he had to situate those attacks within a narrative. And of course, counterterrorism, at least when it's done well, has its own narrative of what it stands for. But I do think the current moment yields itself to battling narratives in an extreme form, almost on steroids, so to speak, because narratives can fly around so fast. This is the digital age. There is something different happening in the way that state actors, non-state actors, some combination of them, can take essentially narratives or little pieces that add up to narratives about what government is or isn't doing, what individuals is or isn't doing, how people should respond to a moment they are dissatisfied with, and make that spread across national boundaries very, very quickly, with at least many intended audience members receiving it and indeed believing it, or at least being willing to entertain it. So there is a way in which narratives are spreading now that's different, and that I think governments are having a hard time responding to.
Okay, interesting. So I would move on to Leanne. We're still waiting for Pak Boy to join us. So the 2020 edition of ASPI's Counterterrorism Yearbook considers three emerging themes that are matters of concern in the current security environment, namely the demise of the IS Caliphate, and what that means globally and regionally for Australia, and also the increased threat from right-wing extremism. We mentioned about that earlier, and the role of technology in propagating violent extremist ideologies. So do you think that these three elements have changed in the context of COVID? Has it become less, or is it equally threatening, or even more so, and why?
So the threat of Islamist extremism is still there. It's probably changed and hasn't had as much time to flourish because terrorists, just like all the rest of us, have been in isolation. There hasn't been movement in regions, or certainly not through countries. There's obviously a much diminished group in Iraq and Syria supporting the ISIL and the Caliphate, but there are still thousands of people there that do. They're still fighting. There's a lot of people in custody throughout the region. I think the COVID impact for that really means that from an Australian perspective, they just can't come back to Australia at the moment, but doesn't mean that planning or gathering more financial support and thinking of different ways to commit acts of violence and terrorism certainly occurring there. The second point in relation to right-wing extremism, I think that's, as Joshua said earlier, that's been growing for a number of years. It's always been there. technology has absolutely accelerated and had a big impact in groups being able to contact each other and build their narratives, build their thinking about why they're so hard done by. I think it's also been impacted by the global financial crisis. That really, that coinciding with the rise of the internet and the ability for people to communicate across the globe, has seen much more partisan politics, much more greater divide. We didn't really have much of a discourse about the left and the right wing in Australia, but that's certainly something that's gained a lot of prominence in recent times. And the impact of COVID-19 on that has been quite profound. Again, because I think, you know, the economics of things, people haven't got access to as much finances and other things. That's going to impact on this feeling of them being hard done by. That's where those extreme fringe groups or extremist groups come into their own, where they start to build their own narrative and their own story about why they're hard done by, and whether that's built on race or cultural issues or whatever ideology they may espouse. It's certainly, we're seeing that increase.
All right, I'm going to read a question. This is for everyone. This question from Kebat Lichayan from Miriam College. Given the current pandemic situation and given the limited resources of the government, what is the best approach of the government to solve the problem? Additionally, what are the safeguards that the government aren't going to use counterterrorism strategies beyond its purpose? I open this question to the floor. Whoever think that want to answer this. Masuda, Josh?
I think I'm going to, I won't directly answer that question. I want to add, because you come up with such a interesting, argument about the narrative, because I think has to do, I'm going to talk about how we should do in terms of narrative. First, like Josh and Leanne already mentioned, when we talk about terrorism, when we talk about the ISIS, there are other issues that we need to look at now, because how the group hijacked this narrative for their own purposes. So we are talking about misinformation. We are talking about digital literacy. So this is the thing that I think that the government should emphasize more during this pandemic. The best way will be, because the best way will be not the COVID. Okay, the COVID itself, I think beyond my knowledge as a political science or scholar on this very issue, but I think other experts can explain more what it is. But apparently apparently COVID has also impacted the way we live, including the way we trust our government, the way we trust the information, the way we use the information through the social media and things like this. So we are seeing the spread of completely misguided information. And this is exactly what the group has been hoping so far. Undermining the government, because if you look at all the issues, especially in Indonesia, we tend to label them as an Islamic terrorist, but in fact, for sure that some of the people, they are clueless about Islam. Some of them even do not know how to read the Quran. But they are but they join because the group that they are joined, like say JI or other group, provide basic services for them, like education, even health. And then the presence of charismatic individual within the group, and then tell them, or again, using the narrative. This is exactly what I think the government should do now as very timely during this COVID pandemic, to rethinking again our narrative in this very issue. I think, going back to your, suggestion, whether war or terror has passed, and then we should embark on new narrative of dealing with this very issue.
Leanne, I see you nodding. Do you think that, is there any government in this world who's basically won the war narratives, or especially if it's related to terrorism?
No, I don't think there is at all. But I also, just going to the question, I don't think it's just government either. The government plays a really key role in their language, in the way that they talk about building trust in government, in their own countries, but it's about how all of the government agencies then work with the private sector, work with community groups, and build that in the community, build the trust, build respect for each other in communities as well. And it's going to be a different sort of discourse depending on who you're talking to, different language, different things. And you're not going to be able to improve that for every single sector and community. So having community, the broad community, supporting government approaches and helping government agencies to work with each other in the community to try to change people's views, to disengage people from certain behaviours, to help with the de-radicalisation processes, build family. And you said it before, Nuta, it's about the education, it's about health, access to employment for people. That, I think, is what's going to change and reduce the incidence of terrorism in individual countries. But that takes a lot of time and a lot of good leadership and a lot of good coordination, which generally is where I feel government should be leading that charge.
Josh, Rommel? Yes, go ahead, Rommel.
Yeah, I need to answer the question because Kebart is my colleague at the Miriam College, and so I know where he's coming from. First of all, the COVID-19 pandemic is providing both challenges and opportunities for terrorism law enforcement. The major challenge is that the COVID-19 pandemic is now being used by terrorist groups in the Philippines as a rallying issue to recruit more members and to intensify their propaganda activities, particularly in the social media. And because of the economic impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, it exacerbates the economic underlying conditions that provide fertile ground for terrorist groups to thrive. So that's the major challenge. But at the same time, there are opportunities because of the lockdown. They can limit the movements of these terrorist personalities and can use the quarantine measure to also intensify law enforcement operations against terrorist groups. And opportunity also in the context of the Philippines is the passing of the anti-terrorism law, which aims to address many other issues that were not addressed by the previous law. For example, in the new law, there is now the creation of Anti-Terrorism Council with additional membership from the Department of Information and Communication. The main purpose of including that particular department office to the Anti-Terrorism Council is to address the operations of terrorist groups operating in social media. Because if you cannot physically move, if you cannot physically recruit members, then they are doing it through social media. And the anti-terrorism law of 2020 aims to address that particular problem. But unfortunately, the hardship resulting from the COVID-19 pandemic is in fact creating more fertile ground for these terrorist groups to recruit more members and intensify their propaganda activities. So they are doing it very fast, and the challenge for law enforcement is to move twice as fast as the terrorist groups.
Very well. Josh?
Echoing that, it is a big and important question. And, before this pandemic came along, there was already a big question debate here in the United States about what the future of counterterrorism looked like in a world that seemed to have additional and increasingly important national security challenges. So the first national security strategy of the Trump administration seemed to diminish at least a bit the focus on counterterrorism. Certainly the first defense strategy of this administration, issued under then Defense Secretary Mattis, really put great power competition front and center and seemed quite deliberately to put counterterrorism in a more constrained or at least less resource intensive place. But how to do that was already a subject of discussion and debate, but not necessarily great answers here in the United States. I think this pandemic has only added to, maybe accelerated, the need to figure out what that means, because at every point, the desire since 9/11 to kind of focus on counterterrorism less has been raised. Essentially, the threat of terrorism has dragged the U.S. government back. That desire to focus less on it has been tempered by a harsh reality. The most prominent, of course, being the really explosion of ISIS and the territory it held and the threat it posed, even as the administration at the time was trying to kind of wind down counterterrorism involvement. So what it means to deal with great power competition, what it means to deal with already other challenges like climate change, and now to add to that the salience of this pandemic, but also I hope the lessons we'll take away for the next pandemic, which may not wait 100 years to come along. I think that will add to the sense that there need to be answers about what sustainable counterterrorism looks like in a US government approach that doesn't make counterterrorism the leading aspect of national security work.
Okay, I'm going to get back to you on that, but I will give the floor to Pak Dino, who also wants to comment on this while waiting Pak Boy to get ready. I see that he's present now. So please, Pak Dino, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. This is also to answer that previous question. One of the things that we at FPCI were worried about was a trend whereby terrorists, instead of attacking randomly at a mall or on the street, they're attacking certain members of a religion in their houses of worship, right? Like in Surabaya, for example, a church was bombed, and obviously there were all Christians inside the church killed by suicide bombers. We saw this in Christchurch in New Zealand. A mosque were attacked. Muslims were specifically targeted by the attacker. And then in Sri Lanka, the church was bombed. In Germany, synagogues were attacked, and I think in the US as well. So we, I think this is a continuing problem. It's not going to end, and it may even get worse. And how we're dealing with it, we believe that there is a sea of inherited bigotry among the Abrahamic religions, followers of Islam, Christianity, and Judaism. So even in countries where there is a democracy, openness, freedom, and tolerance and pluralism, at the grassroots, you still see some frictions, between Muslims and Christians, Muslims and Jews, and so on and so on. And this is happening in Indonesia as well. We got to be open about this. So one of the things that we're doing at FPCI is we are trying to address the problem at the grassroots level, right? Because we notice the interfaith process is undergoing fatigue. Right, there's so many interfaith process where they go for one-day conference, they talk to the converted, and the next day things don't change at the grassroots, right? So what we're trying to do, we've been trying to get a number of religious leaders at the grassroots who have followers and who have some degree of bigotry or discomfort or hostility towards the other religions to live in each other's communities. In a time frame of 3 weeks. We've been doing this exercise, and the result has been miraculous. We had one imam who professed to hating Jewish people, right? And he said, I did it. I hated Jewish people because that's how I've been taught by my family and by my environment. But the moment he went to the US and he lived in the house of American rabbis, all this hatred and stereotypes were erased in a matter of weeks, and now they're just friends and good friends and have maintained that relationship. So I just want to say that there are a lot of ways by which we can use a new narrative and attack inherited bigotry. And keep in mind, a lot of these people are good people, right? They just were misinformed and sort of brainwashed by the community into thinking in a certain way. But once you erase that inherited bigotry at the grassroots level, I think conditions will change and there will be less space for radicalism.
Very well. I would like to greet Pak Boy Rafli Amar. Pak Boy, how are you? The head of Indonesian National Counterterrorism Agency. First of all, congratulations for your new posting. I haven't seen you since your days in Kepolisian, di Polri. But anyway, so we proceed with the conversation. Pak Boy, in terms of terrorist activities in Indonesia, has it been affected by the rise of terror attacks in other parts of the continent, let's say in Africa or in Europe? Has it been affected?
Yeah, good morning, all of you. Thank you, Ms. Andini Effendi, for giving the floor. And First of all, I would like to apologize because coming late in this session because we have another discussion. So many invitations to attend the seminar during pandemic COVID-19. His Excellency Mr. Dino Patijalal, being the leader for policy community of Indonesia, distinguished speaker, Dr. Romel Banuloy, Dr. Yesua, Dr. Huda Ismail, Ms. Leana Cruz, ladies and gentlemen. So, I'm sorry I read my perspective, BNPT perspective first, and then we can discuss what the main subject is we have to be discussing.
Sure.
A very good morning to all of you. Allow me to express my heartfelt appreciation to the foreign policy community of Indonesia for inviting me to this auspicious roundtable discussion. I believe that the topic of the discussion is very relevant in looking into our effort in the fight against terrorism during the COVID-19 pandemic. Allow me to share BNPT's view on this matter. Distinguished speakers, in terms of statistics, in comparison to last year, data on the apprehension of terrorist suspect around 300 in 2019 alone. Up to July this year, the law enforcement agency had only appearance around 100 terrorist suspects. However, the activities, the terrorist group remain significant. Thereby, the government must remain vigilant. The question is why is terrorism still active during the pandemic in Indonesia? Our answer are, first, the COVID-19 is used as a fundamental tool for propaganda by terrorist groups or extremist groups, such as the end of the day scenario. Second, having people look at home and indoors and staying online provide the windows of opportunities for the extremists to recruit, including by inciting terrorist acts. To a certain extent, to incite hate crimes against ethnic minorities, and then the misuse of the humanitarian assistance for terrorist purpose, including terrorist financing. The pandemic provides these opportunities for terrorists or terrorist group to exploit. Ladies and gentlemen, what is BNPT doing? BNPT is back with through law number 5/2018 to coordinate effort in the prevention of terrorism. Prevention is an obligation for the state to implement, and its implementation must uphold human rights and the precautionary principle. The work of BNPT is in prevention focus on three key areas, namely national preparedness, counter-radicalization, and de-radicalization. As the new head of the BNPT, as part of my 100 days dinner program, BNPT is working around the clock to formulate various BNPT regulation as mandated through governmental regulation number 77/2019 on terrorism prevention, among others respectively on counter-radicalization, national preparedness, de-radicalization, and protection of law enforcement from act of the terrorism. As part of enhancing BNPT's counter-radicalization effort, community engagement programs are underway, such as engaging with the ulama, in which BNPT will soon launch the ulama task force. They are our weapons to engage distorted propaganda in justify the religious dogma. And also we engaging with the civil society organization and media focusing and on maintaining and sustaining dissemination of peaceful messages through online and offline platform. Moreover, the need to socialize the principles of Pancasila on a massive scale become ever more relevant. In complementing this effort, BNPT is working toward establishing an online streaming TV. The aim of this program to disseminate counter narrative online by promoting value of the tolerance and moderation, including religious moderation, as well as partake in the National Resilience Program of promoting Indonesia's state philosophy of Pancasila and Bhinneka Tunggal Ika, or unity in diversity. In engaging the youth, BNPT together with the Ministry of Youth and Sports on occasion of the Youth National Day on 28 October 2020 is planning launch a declaration on national preparedness in the prevention of the terrorism due to the fact that youth are our frontline activities, the prevention of terrorism, including as means for further empowerment. As a matter of priority as well, BNPT is putting effort to adopt the draft National Action Plan on preventing and countering violent extremism through a presidential regulation. At the moment, it is at the stage of the harmonization. This document will provide the roadmap as whole of the government and whole of the society approach in mitigating grievance and drivers of the violent extremism leading to terrorism. This document will also serve mitigate the long-term risk associated with the tourism during and after COVID-19 pandemic. That's all, everybody, our perspective. We try engage with all community, across the community, across the profession, across the race, across the religion, how to maintain, how to moderate the extremism in the religion. So, back to you, Ms. Andini.
Thank you, Pak Boy. We already have questions here. Since we have a global audience, we are live on YouTube, FPCI's YouTube channel now. So I will read one of the questions here. So this is from, I'll read the first one. Let me see, because it keeps coming in. So from Glenn Wijaya. Glenn is from Christian Theo and Partners Law Firm. Is there any budget cuts in respect of counterterrorism budget in view of the dire need to prioritize available funds to fight against COVID? I guess this is for you, Pak Boy. Is there any budget cuts for counterterrorism? And then Ms. Nur Huda, you can also jump in. Please go ahead, Pak Boy.
Yeah, especially in our budget, we got cut there about the 76 billion. Yes, this is the reality, but no problem. We still move with the budget, the posture of our budget right now after during pandemic. So, as you know, because pandemic situation, a lot of the program we cannot establish on the field. We cannot make gathering with the community. So most of our program released by the social media. As I said before, that we established the BNPT news channel, television based on the internet, and we try to make so many content, and then try to propaganda by our television, but still in preparing right now. But as we know, also we are working together with the media mainstream, because the propaganda from terrorist group is still ongoing right now. They're not only domestically, but they also coming from others outside the country. So we try fight against the terrorism by build the opinion that they are in the wrong way. So we don't want what they're thinking about the right one to bother Indonesian people, especially teenagers and young people. I think that's my question for that.
Okay, very well, Pak Boy. Josh, I know that you can also answer this. We know that there's a U.S. troop cuts in Africa. So in terms of budget, is there any budget cuts to fight terrorism in the U.S.?
So I think of it more as resource reallocation, in part because, for better or for worse, the U.S. doesn't budget for counterterrorism per se. They budget for different sorts of tools, and post 9/11, a lot of those tools have then been directed at counterterrorism. But the basic premise, I think, is the same, which is, you have decisions to reduce the U.S. troop presence in Syria, in Afghanistan, both under the current president, and, as you mentioned, to reduce the presence in Africa as well. And look, ultimately, the idea of reducing a U.S. troop presence abroad has an appeal, because we all want to keep service members and their families at home if possible, and keep them safe, and we all want to free up resources for a whole bunch of other things. The question is, does the threat allow it? And it's a bit hard to see exactly where the gains have been in some of the terrorism hotspots in Africa and the Middle East and elsewhere that would make it possible to at least dramatically reduce a U.S. presence. And it's not just about the military. Often we talk about the military, but it's about the intelligence that is in some ways can be more critical, because it can tell us whether there is a threat materializing, a particular threat of a particular attack. And both of those things, intelligence and military, that can enable a diplomatic presence in parts of the world where it otherwise would not be safe, would not be possible. Yes, ultimately, I think we're on a trajectory towards scaling down what U.S. counterterrorism presences abroad and activities abroad look like. But how we get there, I think, still requires a lot of assessment of where the threat is going.
Right. I think, Leanne, you can answer this question. This is from Osvaldo in Merauke. Is there any chance for online terrorism recruitment by using terrorism indoctrination, taking advantage of government's failure and or conspiracy theories? How will government screen this online or handle this? Or how should the government screen this online or to handle this compared to suicide bombing, where there will be lack of victim? How will cyber terrorism will be handled by the government in this time of social distancing?
So the radicalization of people online has been occurring prior to COVID, and it's been one of the main and effective strategies when ISIL was forming and wanting to build the caliphate and encourage people to either go to Syria and Iraq to fight with them, or to encourage people to commit acts of violence and terrorism in their own home countries. So that hasn't abated. That will continue in terms of what governments can do. Certainly on the back of the Christchurch massacre, there was a significant amount of global government support and great cooperation between the world leaders and some of the private social media companies. That only goes so far, of course, though, because those public-facing companies and social media things, Facebook, Google, all the rest of it, they try to self-regulate, I think, as much as they can, or they could always do more. It's those pages in the dark web and the other the part of the internet that not everybody actually.
Yeah.
There's a significant amount of work going there, though, to try to do that.
All right. I think we lost you for a second there, but yeah. So I proceed to the next question for Mas Huda. Two questions actually from Indonesia. The first one is from Wandi Adriano. Can you please highlight the recent arrest of terrorists in Indonesia from your perspective? And also Naya is asking you, what would be your suggestion to make sure that the contextual and case-by-case approach will be efficient in Indonesian counter-terrorism strategy? This considering that Indonesian officials still have differing views and practices on the matter, like, for example, in the issue of repatriation.
Okay, first of all, about the recent arrest, I think we have to credit the Indonesian security forces who has been working tirelessly to make sure the security of the country, because they managed to arrest a number of individuals in the process of planning itself. And interestingly, those recent arrests linked to a group that we never know before, linked to terrorist group called, like specific group, which is, but the problem with this recent arrest still has to do with the prison system, our criminal justice system. At least the attack coming from released terrorists, 2 of them, and then also deportees. So we have a problem still struggling with issue of reintegration and rehabilitations. Therefore, now the Indonesian government through Minister of Foreign Affairs has been pushing the approach of PRR, which is a prosecution. We prosecute those foreign fighters, and then another thing will be rehabilitation and social integration. And I think I like the fact that Pak Boy roughly already mentioned specifically the role of civil society, especially the empowerment of ulema, the empowerment of a religious cleric to actually challenge the narrative of these people. And secondly, also the fact that Pak Boy already mentioned the need to engage media more. I think with this COVID-19, what we are seeing at the moment, 3 things. First, captive audience, captive narrative, because people mobility is very difficult, and then they turn into gadget, and like million Indonesians are stuck. So the group has been effectively working tirelessly in the social media to push in the narrative. And then the second thing, for the narrative. Okay, this is like try to discredit the government. And lastly, but sadly also, the group also managed to provide alternative services to their own members. This is what I am going back in the beginning, right? The reason why we keep seeing the rejuvenation of individual joining terrorists, because some of them were joining not merely because of ideology, because also the attraction of services that the group might give to them. So challenging their ideology is one thing, but we need to also understand their existing social network that give them like a community, meaning, and as well purpose in their life. And this is the challenge that I think will be difficult for any state in the world. So therefore, engaging grassroots. I think I fully agree with, Pak Dino, that we need to engage the grassroots levels to actually engage with them, especially now with the released terrorists, And going back to the questions, it's very hard for now, our challenge, especially with the Indonesian government, come up with tailor-made contextual approach, because I think it requires what I should call it political entrepreneurship, because now the government budget, okay, let's say from the finance minister, you need to have a meeting package to engage, let's say, release terrorists in Central Java. Because the budget coming from the central government for meeting package, so BNPT has to organize meeting in a hotel. So because of that, the engagement will be less efficient. It doesn't mean that BNPT team do not understand this. They do understand, but they have the constraint with the financial implication. if we can come up with a big flexibility, tailor-made approach in a specific area, I think, the Indonesian government can work much more efficient, rather than following rigid approach. As again, it's not about the problem with the BNPT, it's about the existing bureaucratic system that, they have to fulfill,
Perhaps it has to be like a new normal in terms of approach.
I don't know. I'm not.
Can we use digital? Can we use technology for this approach?
I think we can use this as an opportunity, come up with a tailor-made approach. Because the real issue now, we don't have massive problem with this terrorism. Let's say we focus on, pointy end, the problem. Let's say people in the prison. Let's say I'm focusing in Central Java now. In Central Java, we have 150 released terrorists. And some of them still incarcerated, 223. If we can work on this and then understanding their connection into their local community, and if we can prepare local community to actually help the Indonesian government for integration, we will be seeing a different picture of a possible threat in the future, because there is kind of an ownership within community. What we are seeing now is a lack of ownership of the community, because they say, "Well, this is government issue," or "This is this is the Western way to credit Islam." So, like, conspiracy theory has been rampant because there is no ownership of the issue, I think.
Right. Okay. So I would like to ask Pak Boy then. You mentioned about the Ulama Task Force. When is it going to be formalized? And then I guess you can also, what's your point of view based on Mas Huda was saying that we need to have a different approach now, since the bureaucracy can be no longer valid in this new normal phase?
As long as I'm here, you never make the radicalization problem in the hotel. I think we are trying to engage with the community directly, and we have to example the radicalization program in two places. One place in the Lamongan and the other one in the Deli Serdang, Sumatera. The other thing that we still thinking about the new radicalization program, what we call agrowisata tourism agrowisata. For the perpetrators, the target, we still prepare for the three location. The first one in the East Java, and the other one, the second one in the center of the Sulawesi, and the third one in the Nusa Tenggara Barat, West Nusa Tenggara. And the other thing, we also working close with the moderate ulama to prevent the extremists in religion. We try to make like narration in the social media, and also after COVID-19 pandemics, we try to see the community directly. The grassroots, of course, is very dangerous because some the terrorists group, they recruit the young people, the poor people, and try to change his mind, and then try give the target to them, so that we try to see the grassroots level. We plan invite the moderate ulama, talk to them to reduce the radicalization among the young people.
Yeah. So it's already been finalized. It's already been formalized, this Ulama Task Force, yeah, Pak?
Yeah, still ongoing. So,
okay.
But I have already talked to leader of Nahdlatul Ulama, leader of the Muhammadiyah. We're still waiting who is the best ulama, moderate ulama,
right,
possible join with us.
Very well. All right. The next question is from Camille Vismonte from Georgetown University. This is for Josh. What kinds of new forms of terrorism have been amplified during the pandemic within the context of the U.S.? And how has the U.S. counterterrorism strategy changed during COVID?
You know, one thing I think we're seeing, and it's not brand new, but we're seeing new manifestations of it, is vehicular form of attacks, right? So we saw this back in Nice in France as ISIS related. We saw it in Charlottesville, Virginia, as a white supremacist took the life of one person and injured many others. And now we're seeing it in incidents that seem to range from the ideologically driven to the more just emotional or emotive. But given the gatherings that we see right now in the United States, many driven with a push for social justice and to try to address problems like racism here, in a sense that those numbers of people present, unfortunately, targets of opportunity. And we've seen incidents like that. So that's a tactic we can trace from actually Palestinian Israeli times to ISIS, to white supremacists, and now to the current moment. And so as these gatherings, I suspect, continue, I hope that those who are charged with protecting Americans here are trying to figure out ways to try to get in front of this, because it may be an old tactic, but it seems to be taking on new life, unfortunately, right now.
Right. Okay. I think we still have time for a few more questions. This is from Noto Suoneto from China Policy Group. Report said that the antipathy directed at everything that is symbolically linked to China, be it Chinese companies operating in Indonesia or Chinese Indonesian communities, by conflation, is spreading within radical groups amid the COVID-19 outbreak. What is the strategy of BNPT to anticipate this threat? Ini untuk Pak Boy. Is there any anticipation from BNPT for the Chinese companies or Chinese Indonesian communities? And also maybe Rommel, you can also explain from the Philippines example. I know that Duterte's government is very close to China, but is there an antipathy towards China after this pandemic? Right, maybe Rommel wants to answer first.
Well, when it comes to the Philippines, our antipathy towards China has not developed yet into violent activities. You know, it's still confined to civil and political actions. So we don't know of any threats physically against Chinese, but we know that China is receiving very low trust rating in the Philippines, and there are strong anti-China sentiments among Filipinos. But in Mindanao, we know that Chinese were targets of kidnapping activities of the Abu Sayyaf group, because they are considered to be rich with money, so they can pay ransom. But most of these Chinese are Malaysian Chinese. But we have cases in the past where Chinese were targeted for kidnap for ransom coming from Guangzhou province. But in general, sentiments of the Filipino people against the Chinese has not deteriorated yet into any violent activities. But there are calls for some to boycott Chinese products because of China continuing action in the West Philippine Sea. But we remain to be diplomatic here.
Right. Okay. So I want to hear. So what about from in Indonesia, BNPT? Are you doing anything to anticipate this threat? Silakan, Pak Boy.
Yeah. Thank you, Anthony. Because related with China's migrant worker, yeah, sometimes this issue being raised by the intolerant group, but this only related with the fairness in get the chance for working in. But I think not really from the radical terrorist group, but they're coming because the chance of the local people, because thousands migrant workers from China, they are coming to Indonesia. But the problem, the local people, they have chance, according to them, to join the company, the investment company in Indonesia. But in generally, this is not, I believe, this is not related directly with the terrorist act. But we try to support the local authority, local government, to spare, to disseminate moderate thinking to our people. And of course, with the security, our law enforcement to more protect to all the migrant workers. This is very important to save their life, whatever they do in the company, investment company in Indonesia. I think that's it.
Right. Okay. So we have to move forward. So in terms of, we're discussing how can we move on, I guess, with this counterterrorism effort, especially after the pandemic. So we're talking about global leadership, which I guess critics says that the US has been absent in doing that and it has been taken over by other countries, including China. In the respect of counterterrorism efforts, how important do the speakers think about a strong global leadership? And then how can we also build an effective and well-coordinated international cooperation? Because now it's pretty much like the country is on their own dealing with the COVID-19, right? So how can we move forward with this issue? I guess I will start with you, Josh.
Yeah, so I do think the global cooperation, coordination on counterterrorism is essential because terrorist groups do not respect state borders and state boundaries. They operate across borders. And if one is going to keep up with them or ideally get ahead of them, that's going to require cooperation that also transcends state borders. I think as someone somewhat disappointed in the direction that counterterrorism has gone in the United States under President Trump, it seems a step backwards on that front rather than a step forwards. You know, you see this rather extraordinary coalition that was assembled to roll back ISIS from the territory it once held in Iraq and Syria. And under the current administration, the U.S. has essentially unilaterally stood down much of the effort that was going on there. It's hard to ask others to step up when you're stepping back. Similarly, after the terrible Christchurch attack and the role that the internet played in the almost immediate dissemination, well, there was dissemination in real time, and there was continued dissemination thereafter of the horrors of that attack. You had this call by countries, all with different legal regimes, but asking tech companies to step up and do more. The United States was absent from that. So I think that absence looms large. I don't want to overstate the role of the United States, especially in this global crowd with folks representing various countries that have extraordinary expertise and capacity to do counterterrorism. But from where I sit, we all do it better when we're doing it in a coordinated and collaborative way. And my hope is to see the U.S. in the future go back to being a more constructive international partner.
Right, Leanne. So I met with your PM a couple months ago, actually, and then he was mentioning that there's a need of like a strong partnership between Australia and Indonesia, especially in regards to counterterrorism. But with this whole pandemic, do you think that is happening now? Australia is closing its borders with Indonesia, obviously. So how do you think of this global leadership should be led in this region?
So, of course, and so we've had fantastic relationship in Australia and with Indonesia. Indonesia's led many of the initiatives and having, for example, the Jakarta Centre for Law Enforcement Cooperation in Semarang. That's been a major feature of cooperation between countries and also the broader Asia Pacific region. COVID's obviously had an impact in relation to travel and being able to build those partnerships and continue the effort. But within our intelligence agencies, law enforcement agencies, community sector, academia, the relationships are strong, and I think they'll continue to remain strong when individuals in those agencies keep the dialogue happening between each other. We've had great cooperation in bilateral relationships, in particular with Indonesia, but multilateral relationships have been a bit strained through COVID, understandably. But I think that will continue to repair and to gain strength in the fight against terrorism, because there's violence in our communities isn't acceptable, and so there's that common spirit of wanting to combat that, learn from each other, understand how we can deal with the issues in different ways. So I think that will be a positive outcome into the future. We just have to, through COVID, do things maybe in a different way, like these sort of forums.
Right. Rama?
Well, of course, we want the United States and China to lead the world, not only unilaterally, but in unity. We don't want US and China being divided, because if US and China are divided, the world will be divided, and we will be forced to choose between the two major powers. So in my opinion, there's a necessity for the two major powers to settle their differences and overcome their current security tensions right now. And in the area of counterterrorism, because I'm involved in a research on counterterrorism cooperation, we are seeing different models coming from the United States and coming from China when it comes to countering terrorism. And we want the two to get along, to share their respective exemplary practices in order to lead the world in the battle against terrorism. And we thank the United States for continuous assistance to the Philippines in counterterrorism. In fact, that is one of the major considerations on why President Duterte suspended the termination of the Visiting Forces Agreement, because we want continuing assistance from the United States to build our capabilities to fight terrorism. And we are also open to receive counterterrorism training from China and also from Australia. We thank Australia for providing continuing assistance to our Philippine Data Bank Center of the Philippine National Police, and the Philippine National Police continues to the Australian Federal Police continues to assist our police authorities in building capabilities to fight terrorism. The United States is building counterterrorism training in the Philippines. So we want the two major powers to take the leadership in unity, not against each other. So we want the two to cooperate, because if we see China and the United States cooperating jointly to fight this terrorism, the world will be in unity also. But if we see the two superpowers in conflict, then the world is in fact divided. Thank you.
Mas Huda, your thought on this?
I think it's just no doubt that it is a must to have a strong international relations, strong cooperations, because the very nature of terrorism itself is transnational. Even though, let's say, a lot of attack here locally, but at least their political imagination is global. Let's say they attack in Indonesia, in Bali, but they imagine that this attack has to do with imagine solidarity of global Muslim suffering in conflict places. What happened in Syria may affect what happened in Indonesia. What happened in in southern Philippines also inspire many Indonesians to travel, especially today has been mediated by social media and the internet and then all of this. So I think we need to strengthen the existing international structure, and like it or not, US has been demonstrating leadership, I think before Trump's, like enormous resources. And then I think we need to continue to do that. I think publicly, yes, we are struggling with the global leadership because, currently it's very myopic, very locals. That is the narrative that has been, playing out in the local politics in the US. But behind the scene, I think people like us, the academic, civil society, still working, very strongly with our own ways and our creativity. Because we do understand that we cannot afford not to have such a strong cooperation, and this is, we need to empower the existing international structure, either the UN, or here nationally, we need to strengthen ASEAN, And also, we cannot take for granted that existing peace now will last longer. And then thanks to this existing international structure, that we have.
Right. I still have one more question for Josh, and then I will ask another question for Pak Boy. So this is from Esther at UMass Boston / John Hopkins. As you know, there has been increased instances of digital terrorism. For example, in the US, Incels and white supremacists have been finding facets online. How has this affected the US counterterrorism strategy, or we have traditionally viewed terrorism?
I think this really has been the dominant way in which both international terrorist groups are able to elicit attacks in the United States. It has not been by sending operatives to U.S. soil, with the recent exception of the Pensacola, Florida attack, which does seem to be that more traditional model. But instead, it's been trying to get those already present in the United States to undertake violence here. So that's San Bernardino, that's Orlando. And for more domestic groups, incels, white supremacists, even these are not wholly domestic anymore. They have international links. They are inspired, unfortunately, by attacks in other places, but they are increasingly working online too. They have a different online style in many ways. Especially white supremacists have this tendency to use humor, to exploit cultural memes, to inject symbols, to at times even poke fun at themselves. But ultimately, it is to radicalize and recruit followers. And that is, as others have said, something that government needs to recognize. But the battleground, so to speak, is actually possessed by the private sector. It is the social media platforms. And so the work with them that the U.S. government did with respect to ISIS, with respect to Al-Qaeda, to try to educate them better and offer a way for those companies to do more. I'm not sure if that's happening, if those channels are still open in the same way for white supremacist or incel terrorism, but I think it's essential.
Right. Okay. So this is the closing statement from all of the speakers. I'll start with you, Pak Boy. How can we develop a competent global multi-institution interventions efforts in the aspect of counterterrorism? And then Mas Rommel, you can continue after Pak Boy.
Okay, I think we have to.
Rommel, excuse me. Please let Pak Boy speaks first, and then after him, you go ahead.
Very energetic speaker, you, Rommel.
Yeah.
Yeah. For us, for Indonesia, I think we are very active, meeting with the United Nations Office on Counterterrorism. I still remember last month we have the virtual meeting, and international relations, especially with some countries who are concerned with the combating terrorism in Indonesia, like the US, Australia, and a lot of some countries from Europe and Africa. They also invite us to virtual meeting, and we discuss a lot, and we plan to create some MOU in capacity building, sharing intelligence, information, and some program. Like we try now create the knowledge hub program. It's been that we are accommodate all the foreigners who are concerned in Indonesia, or the institution they are dealing with the counterterrorism from the UN or from the other country. We try to create, accommodate, and make program together with the civil society organization also. Now still ongoing. So basically, Indonesia very open with the international support in combating terrorism. So that's why day by day here, we have a lot of meeting in virtual meeting, and then we plan to make memorandum of understanding, and we create some program together. So we have strong commitment in keeping the spirit of the international cooperation. That's
Rama?
Well, of course, we have to be reminded that we have existing UN Global Counterterrorism Strategy, and we have to sustain the implementation of that strategy worldwide. And we have the UN Global Counterterrorism Committee in charge of building capacities of states to respond to terrorism. But what I observe is that the United Nations is focusing largely on building capabilities of the central government. So I think it's high time that we strengthen efforts to build capabilities also, as mentioned earlier by our Indonesian counterpart from PNPT. We have to strengthen the role of civil society organization and also the role of local government authorities. We have the United Cities and local authorities. So we need to harness the potential of these stakeholders in order to fight terrorism at the front lines. So we should not only focus our attention on building capabilities of central government, but also building capabilities of civil society organizations in order to promote and uphold a community-based approach to counterterrorism, and at the same time to strengthen the capabilities of local government authorities in order to deliver services to the people, particularly in conflict-affected areas, because local governments are in the front lines of service delivery to the people. If local governments fail, then central government will also fail. And I think we should be informed of that necessity to empower civil society organizations and local government authorities in this global fight against terrorism.
Leanne, go ahead.
So I totally agree with everything that Rommel said there, and particularly in relation to the United Nations. They have a key role to play. I think, unfortunately, for the United Nations, it's a very big bureaucracy, and it's difficult at the moment with various political discussions and impacts across the globe. But one really good example of global cooperation has been the Financial Action Task Force and the outcomes they're achieving in countering terrorism financing and anti-money laundering. I think that's a great model going forward, where countries could focus on counterterrorism efforts and support United Nations outcomes as well as our individual outcomes in terms of cooperation, holding ourselves to account, understanding what we're trying to achieve in this space, sharing intelligence, sharing information, sharing services and support and practice and learning from that. So there's some good models that are working out there. We just need to have the leadership within our own countries and our own organisations to keep taking that forward into the future.
Hello, are you asking me now? I can't hear you.
I think you may be muted.
Josh first.
Sure.
Okay.
Well, just as this conversation indicates, by just where all of us are in the world, it is inherently a global problem when one talks about terrorism. And to add to the earlier comments, a piece that is global is the digital piece, the tech platforms that are being exploited, not by most users, but by some very small percentage of users to try to do some very bad things. They are generally global. There are some exceptions to that, but they are generally global platforms. And part of what you hear from those platforms is they find it hard to understand what some governments want and what other governments want. And they need to deal with different legal regimes. But that's where, that's part of why I was disappointed to see the US sit out thus far, at least, the Christchurch call, which was specifically designed to offer a more coherent, more coordinated, and ideally at some point, truly global position on what the expectations are to try to make for a more contested space for violent extremists looking to recruit online. And I think as those platforms remain sites that terrorists use to attempt to recruit and radicalize, the idea of governments having a greater dialogue with each other and then together with the companies about what could make us all safer. I think that's critical.
Mas Huda?
Okay, I think I have two points to conclude our discussion today. I think I have been embarking a number of international discussion on this very issue, but most of us keep talking about our success story. I think in the next, what I really hope is we can have more talking about our failures, why we failed, I think my favorite quote in Batman is when the question is, why do we fall? So that we can pick ourselves up, learning from mistake. I think we can learn more from our mistake than our success. And then in success itself is oftentimes context specific. What is working in Indonesia, I'm not so sure can be applicable in Southern Philippines. What is good in Southern Philippines cannot be applicable in Afghanistan. So understanding context specific is very critical in our future sharing. And second thing, in terms of the role of government and technology company, especially communication company like YouTube and Facebook and things like that, we often obsess with a negative approach where by the time we just take down all the content, but we often ignore what we call it the positive approach. We need to engage the narrative of these peoples, because taking down alone will not solve the problem of root causes of the issue. We need to also address the material grievances, the grievances on the ground that actually fuel the very reason for the radicalization of this individual. And I think with COVID today, we need to come up, as Andini said, new normal, new ways of engaging. We cannot use all textbook. In the past, we have been talking about gender mainstreaming. Now we need to talk about COVID mainstreaming. How can we, every single approach of us with new in mind, COVID, what to do with this, in this COVID era. I think that's what I can share with you all, and it has been a pleasure being part of this discussion.
So we need a creative approach for counterterrorism, and then also the war on terror is still real, although it has evolved to narratives, and then a strong global partnership needs to exist even more. So yes, this time around, I guess, right? For this
I think you should be our next speaker at Andini.
I don't want to take your position. Let me be the moderator and you'll be the expert. But thank you so much, speakers, Mas Huda, Joshua, Leanne, Roma, and then of course, Pak Boy. Thank you very much for your insights and your thoughts on this. I would like to also thank FPCI for having this event, having this insightful event. And thank you for the audience worldwide who has been watching us from 9 a.m. Jakarta time. Thank you and have a good day, everyone. Thank you.
Terima kasih.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Andini. Good job.
Thank you, Badino.
Good job.
Thank you, Leanne.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Really enjoyed it. Good conversation.
Thank you, Josh.